Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The early sun had barely cracked through the Jos Plateau clouds when Anna stepped off the bus, her threadbare shoes landing in a shallow puddle outside the service gate of the Onakoi estate. The mist hovered low over the ground, brushing the tops of the manicured hedges like a whisper. It was a place of stillness, where silence had settled into the walls and didn't like to be disturbed. The estate was unlike anything she had ever known, an expanse of manicured lawns, giant windows that never opened, and halls that echoed with the hush of secrets too delicate to name. Anna adjusted the strap of her old bag. It seemed stretched by time and overuse, and tucked in the side that had started to fray. She wore the same blue uniform she had for 5 years, clean, but faded like old memory. As she approached the staff entrance, her eyes caught the golden letters above the gate, peace through order. It made her scoff quietly every morning. There was very little peace for people like her, and order was just another word for quiet servitude. The guard Musa barely looked up from his bench as she walked in. They'd reached an understanding long ago. He wouldn't bother with greetings if she didn't. That suited her fine. She passed through the corridors like breath under a door, silent and unnoticed. The cooks were already clattering in the kitchen, the gardeners out trimming hedges that were already perfect. Her job was to clean the west wing, a part of the estate rarely used, yet polished every day like someone important might walk in and see their reflection in the floors. That never happened. No one walked those halls except for Anna. Still, she swept, scrubbed, dusted, and polished, as if the chandeliers themselves could sense neglect. Anna worked like someone chasing a ghost. Each sweep of her mop was done with the discipline of a soldier, not because anyone watched, no one ever did, but because something in her demanded it. She didn't talk much, not to the other cleaners, not to the cooks, not even to the young gardeners who sometimes joked too loudly behind the greenhouses. Her eyes always seemed to be searching for something. Her silence wasn't cold, but complete. It was the silence of someone who had carried too much for too long, and had simply run out of words. Inside her pocket, she kept a small photograph of her younger sister, Ella, whose hospital bills took half of her pay. The other half vanished like smoke. Rent for her single-room apartment in Bakuru, meals that barely filled the belly, transportation fares that rose with every passing week. She didn't complain. Complaining had never changed the price of Gary, or brought the electricity back when it went. Life was what it was. You tightened your belt and kept walking. And Anna walked every day, through Jos's traffic-choked roads, through the wide marble-floored halls of Onakoi, through exhaustion, through hunger, through aching knees and stiff fingers. Her days were measured by tasks completed and floors left spotless. She worked while others talked, listened while others laughed, and remembered what others forgot. That morning, while dusting the narrow corridor near the back gardens, she felt a strange pull, like a thread tugging at the hem of her attention. Something was different. A soft sound, like the scraping of plastic on gravel. Barely there. Not enough to stop a lesser cleaner. But Anna had ears sharpened by survival. She followed the sound through the side path that led behind the old garden shed, a place mostly forgotten, where broken pots and rusted shears were kept. And there, crouched in the shadow, she saw him. He was so still at first that she thought he might be a figment of her tired eyes, a ghost from her own past perhaps, drawn by the ache in her bones. But no, he was real. A boy no more than 9 or 10, curled like a wounded cat against the wall. His shirt was torn, his arms too thin, skin smeared with dirt and eyes that held the color of sorrow. He didn't flinch when she stepped closer. He simply watched her with the dull alertness of someone who had stopped expecting kindness. Anna's instinct screamed to speak, to ask him who he was and how he got there. But something in her stopped. Words would only scare him off. She knew that look. She had worn it once too. The look of someone who'd been told too many lies in soft voices. She knelt, careful not to startle him, and pulled from her bag the small foil-wrapped sandwich she had prepared for herself the night before. Just bread and margarine, with a pinch of pepper. Her dinner, technically. She'd skipped supper just to have something to bring today. Her stomach rumbled as she unwrapped it, but she ignored it and placed it on the ground before him. The boy stared at it for a full minute before snatching it, hands trembling, and began to eat like time itself might steal it back. She didn't speak. She just watched. Not with pity, but with recognition. She'd been hungry like that once. She remembered the sharp ache in the belly that made it hard to breathe. She remembered her mother crying quietly in the dark, pretending not to hear the growling stomachs around her. As the boy ate, Anna stood, wiped her palms on her skirt, and walked back inside. She said nothing to anyone. That evening, after her shift, Anna didn't go straight home. Instead, she sat on the low stone bench near the bus stop, watching the dying sun stretch across the hills of Joss like a weary traveler folding into rest. The sky turned copper, then violet, then navy blue. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from questions she couldn't answer. Who was the boy? Why was he there? Was he hiding? Was someone looking for him? She had no answers, only an ache in her chest that hadn't been there yesterday. It lingered like smoke in her lungs. On the bus ride home, she leaned her forehead against the window and watched the city pass by in streaks of light and shadow. Somewhere between Terminus and Bakuru, she made a quiet decision. Tomorrow, she would bring more food. Maybe a boiled egg. Maybe a bit of akra if she had coins left. Something warm. Something filling. She didn't tell herself it was her responsibility. She didn't even know his name. But sometimes, the heart makes decisions the mind cannot explain. The next morning, she rose before dawn, wrapped her lunch carefully in a clean napkin, and added half a bottle of water. She was used to giving away things she couldn't afford to lose. But this felt different. This wasn't charity. This was recognition. A whisper from one life to another, I see you. And in a world that often turned its back on the invisible, Anna's quiet act of kindness would become the first thread in a tapestry neither she nor the boy could yet imagine. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that someone had seen her. From the high window of the main house, behind the veil of lace curtains, a pair of eyes watched everything. The next 3 mornings were heavy with fog and thick with uncertainty. Anna began to alter her routine without knowing why, waking 15 minutes earlier, wrapping her food more carefully, scanning the bus station with sharper eyes. She didn't tell herself she was looking forward to seeing the boy again. It was a thought too bold, too conscious, but her body moved with the quiet momentum of expectation. The same hidden path behind the shed welcomed her each day with wet soil and the smell of overgrown grass. And there he was again, as though he'd never left, curled near the same rusted watering can, his back against the cracked wooden wall, head buried in his knees. He didn't speak on the second day either, but when Anna set down the bundle of yam and tomato stew wrapped in old newspaper, he raised his eyes just long enough to meet hers. It was only a flicker, but it was there, a thank you that never found words. The third day brought the first sign of change. The boy had shifted positions, sitting upright before she arrived, almost as if he had been waiting. His shirt had a new tear near the collar, his eyes were still wary, but there was a flicker of something else behind them. A faint curiosity, the kind that takes root after too much fear. Anna didn't ask questions. She simply laid down her small parcel, 2 slices of bread and a sachet of water, and lingered a few seconds longer than usual. She found herself memorizing the way he held the bread, how he bent his head forward slightly before taking the first bite, as though offering a silent prayer. She remembered seeing her younger brother do the same during the lean years, back when their mother rationed food like a soldier counting bullets. Hunger didn't just haunt the stomach, it carved its initials into the spirit. Each day that followed became part of an unspoken rhythm, a quiet song only the two of them knew. Anna continued to bring what little she could afford, a half-eaten corn cob from dinner, 2 bananas one day, a wrapped acro ball the next. She never brought her full lunch again. The boy's needs felt louder than her own hunger. The sacrifices didn't go unnoticed by her own body, which began to ache in places it hadn't before. The bones in her feet protested against the cold floor, and her temples throbbed more often during midday. But there was something warm about the mornings now, something that bloomed in her chest every time she rounded the corner and saw that small, fragile figure waiting. Once, she left behind a small blanket she'd found discarded in the laundry bins, a forgotten piece from a guest's quarters, clean but fraying. She folded it neatly and placed it beside his spot without a word. The next morning, the boy was wrapped in it like a cocoon. He didn't smile, but she noticed how his breathing had steadied, how his shoulders weren't pulled up so tightly to his ears. She began to wonder where he slept when the night came. Was it behind the shed? Did he have a hiding place deeper in the estate? Did he run when the staff left? Or stay silent like a shadow, waiting for the world to sleep? She wanted to ask but held her tongue. Trust was not a thing to be demanded. It had to be built, layer by quiet layer, like a nest woven from twigs. So she waited. Not for answers, but for the day the boy might speak without fear. One Thursday afternoon, as she walked back through the service hallway, her arms heavy with laundry, she overheard two guards talking near the back door. They were laughing about something, but one line stopped her in her tracks. "That small Pekin dey hide for backyard like rat," one of them said, chuckling. "Oga say make we no touch him, just dey watch." Her heart froze, then began to pound like a talking drum. They'd seen him. They knew. And worse, someone had given orders. Oga? That could only mean Victor Hemsley himself. Anna forced her legs to keep moving, pretending not to hear, but her mind spiraled. Why would the master of the estate, reclusive, powerful, rarely even in Joss, care about a boy living behind a shed? Why tell the guards not to act? A strange chill crept into her spine. Was it a test? Was this all some twisted trick? Had she endangered the boy by helping him? That night, she barely slept. The questions clung to her like thorns. She wasn't sure if the boy was being protected or watched like a caged bird. She wished he would talk. Even a single word could change everything. The next morning, she almost didn't bring food. Almost. But when the time came, she packed a small meal anyway. White rice and groundnut soup wrapped in foil, a plastic spoon tucked into her pocket. When she arrived, the boy was waiting again, standing this time. His knees wobbled slightly, but he didn't sit. When she handed him the food, his eyes locked on hers longer than before. Still no words. But something deeper passed between them, an invisible handshake between two survivors. Neither knew what lay ahead, but for that moment, the space between them was filled with quiet understanding. On the fourth Friday of that strange new routine, something unexpected happened. Rain had fallen all night, turning the garden soil into thick brown slush. The clouds still hung low, and the wind bit through Anna's sleeves as she made her way around the usual corner. But the boy wasn't there. His usual spot was empty. The blanket, usually folded and placed on the broken step, was gone. She froze, her stomach twisting in alarm. She checked behind the tool shed, under the eaves, even behind the tall grass beside the compost heap. Nothing. Her breath came quicker, sharper. Was he gone for good? Had someone taken him? Had the guards finally intervened? Her fingers shook as she reached for the food parcel in her bag. She left it there anyway, placing it gently on the ground, her hands brushing away the wet leaves. Then she returned to work with a cloud hanging over her head. All day her thoughts drifted. She polished doorknobs without seeing them. She refolded the same sheet 3 times. At one point, she mistakenly walked into the wrong corridor, something she hadn't done in years. Her body was at work, but her mind was in the back garden. When her shift ended, she returned to the shed path, this time with her coat pulled tight against the evening wind. And there, curled up beneath the low wooden bench, was the boy, soaked to the bone, trembling. He had come back. She knelt beside him without hesitation, pulled off her coat, and wrapped it around his small frame. His lips moved, just barely. A whisper. Finn. The name fell from his mouth like a secret the world had forgotten. Anna didn't smile. She just nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. Finn. No more questions. No more silence. A name was a beginning. And beginnings, even fragile ones, were sacred. The wind over Joss was harsh that morning, brushing the tops of the trees like an angry hand. It hissed through the narrow stone passageways of the Anakoy estate, sending dried leaves scuttling across the marble floors that Anna had polished only the day before. As she made her way along the side path toward the shed, she could hear the sound of distant branches cracking, a warning that the day would be long and difficult. Her coat, still damp from the night before, clung to her skin as she walked. In her hand, she carried a flask of pap she had boiled before dawn and wrapped in 2 layers of cloth. When she reached the familiar corner, the boy, Finn, was already sitting upright, the blanket wrapped around him tightly, his back straight despite the cold. He was no longer just a shadow hiding in the cracks. He had become part of her day, woven into it like thread through fabric. She crouched beside him and opened the flask slowly, allowing the steam to rise and drift into the chill air. Finn's hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. Still, he made no sound, and Anna did not press him. It was enough that he had returned. She sat beside him, not too close, listening to the distant calls of gardeners trimming hedges and the soft clang of workers dragging steel carts across the paving stones. There was a stillness to that part of the estate, untouched by the noise of the main house. And in that stillness, they existed together, neither speaking, both understanding something they couldn't explain. Later that afternoon, after her duties were completed, Anna was summoned unexpectedly. One of the junior staff knocked on the cleaner's quarters, eyes wide, voice thin. "Madam Anna, the master say make you come to the drawing room." For a moment, the words didn't register. No cleaner was ever called to the drawing room. That space was reserved for diplomats, high-profile guests, and the occasional pastor with political connections. Her mind raced through every possibility. Had she been caught? Was it about the boy? Was she being dismissed without warning? Still, her feet moved. Down the long hallway she walked, her shoes clicking softly against the polished tiles. The doors of the west drawing room loomed before her like gates of judgment. When she entered, the room was cold despite the warmth of the sun spilling through the high-arched windows. There was only one person inside, Victor Hemsley. He stood near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, the other holding a small white teacup that looked oddly delicate in his grip. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since she had been hired, she felt truly seen. Not just looked at, but seen, like her presence was not merely tolerated but acknowledged. "Close the door," he said simply. She obeyed. Her pulse thudded in her ears. There was no chair offered, no pretense of comfort. Just silence and the weight of his stare. Finally he spoke. "You've been feeding him." It wasn't a question. It was a statement layered with meaning. Anna's instinct was to deny it, to reach for the closest excuse and wrap herself in it. But she had never been a good liar, not even as a child, and certainly not in the face of someone like Victor Hemsley. She lifted her chin slightly, a motion she hadn't planned, and met his gaze. "Yes, sir." Her voice was even, though her fingers curled tightly around the fabric of her skirt. Victor took a slow sip from his cup, the sound of porcelain tapping against his teeth barely audible. Then he walked toward the window, his back now turned to her. "Do you know who he is?" The question landed like a hammer. Anna opened her mouth, then closed it. She shook her head, even though he couldn't see. "No, sir. I don't." Her words fell into the room like small stones into deep water. Victor didn't speak for a long while. She could see the way his shoulder muscles tensed beneath the fine fabric of his coat. When he finally turned back around, there was something different in his eyes. Not softness, but an absence of the usual steel. "His name is Daniel," he said. "He is my grandson." The words had weight, not because of the boy's lineage, but because of what they revealed about the man who spoke them. Anna felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the flood of realization crashing through her. The boy she had been feeding, the one she had wrapped in her coat, was not just a hungry child with no place to go. He was the heir to the estate, to a name carved into glass and marble. She felt suddenly small, a cleaner from Bakuru with calloused palms and a frayed uniform, standing in the middle of a truth far too large for her. Victor did not explain himself at first. Instead, he returned to the fireplace and set the cup down with deliberate care. 2 years ago my daughter, Clara, died. His voice was not emotional, but there was a thread of sorrow woven into the words, thin and stretched. Her son, Daniel, was placed in the care of someone I trusted. That person disappeared 6 months later. We searched, investigated, paid people to track them. Nothing. We assumed the boy had been taken far away, maybe across the border. He paused and took a slow breath. We never imagined he had returned, that he was here, under our roof. His eyes met hers again. "But you saw him." There was no accusation in his tone. If anything, it sounded like awe. Anna felt her throat tighten. She thought of Finn, Daniel, how he had crouched beneath the bench, silent and shaking, never once asking for anything. She had seen a child in pain, not a missing heir. She had acted on instinct, not information. "Why didn't you stop me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "If you knew I was bringing him food, why didn't you?" Her voice trailed off. Victor took a moment, then answered. "Because I wanted to see what you would do." There was something in his voice now, reflection, perhaps even regret. "I have everything a man could want. But no one around me does anything without a reason. Money, favors, status. You gave what little you had without knowing who he was." The silence returned between them, deeper than before. Anna didn't know what to say. She had not come here to impress anyone. She had only followed her conscience. She stood there, in that grand room, unsure of what came next. But one thing was clear, everything had changed. Rain had returned to Joss with a kind of stubbornness, soaking the rooftops, gurgling through gutters, and leaving the stone paths of Onakoi estate slick and gleaming like polished slate. Anna walked with measured steps, her eyes sweeping the corridors with more alertness than before. Since the conversation with Victor, her every movement felt heavier, more scrutinized, even though no one said anything. The master hadn't issued further instructions. No staff member confronted her. Life at the estate continued its quiet rhythm, but Anna knew that things were no longer the same. The silence had changed. It now carried a kind of watchfulness, a silent acknowledgement that she was no longer invisible. She noticed how the other staff greeted her with slight pauses, how the kitchen assistant, Amina, stared a second longer than usual when handing her a plate. Something unspoken had settled over the estate like a film of dust. Still, Anna's routine didn't change outwardly. She cleaned the rooms assigned to her. She folded linens and aired out unused quarters. But each morning, before the sun climbed too high, she still slipped behind the shed with food and a scarf or a warmer cloth for the boy. Except now, she carried more than food. She carried knowledge. The boy, Daniel, was no longer just a face she found behind the garden. He was the grandson of a man who owned everything her eyes could see. Yet when she looked at him, she didn't see wealth. She saw ribs beneath thin fabric. She saw bruises hidden by silence. And she saw someone who had still not learned how to speak in full trust. Daniel didn't talk much, but in the days following her meeting with Victor, small things began to shift. He started arriving before her, sitting up straighter, as if some invisible weight had lifted slightly from his shoulders. Once, when she brought Puff Puff wrapped in brown paper, he took the package carefully and whispered, "Thank you." The words came out stiffly and used to being spoken, but they landed in Anna's ears like the striking of a bell. She responded only with a nod, careful not to overwhelm him. It became clear to her that Daniel wasn't just hungry in the way that hollowed out the belly. He was hungry for safety, for warmth, for someone to see him without demanding something in return. On one unusually hot afternoon, Anna found a shaded patch near the shed and brought along a small storybook she had rescued from the laundry room. The title was faded, the corners frayed, but the pages were intact. She sat and began to read aloud, not expecting a reaction. Her voice was even gentle, steady. At first, Daniel didn't move. But slowly, as the rhythm of the tale settled in the air, he scooted a little closer, inch by inch. By the time she reached the third page, he was sitting beside her, not touching, but close enough for their arms to almost brush. She kept her eyes on the words. She didn't dare look up. In that fragile space, she understood something unspoken. Daniel wasn't just learning to trust her. He was learning to come back to the world. Piece by piece. Wort by wort. Presence by presence. And Anna, without ceremony, was becoming his doorway. One evening, after the sun dipped behind the hills and the estate lights flickered on one by one like stars being summoned, Anna stayed behind a little longer than usual. The air had grown cooler, and Daniel had fallen asleep on the old garden bench, the blanket tucked up to his chin. She watched him breathe, slow and even, for several minutes before gently gathering her things. She knew she couldn't let him sleep there all night again. Not anymore. Not when she now understood his connection to the estate, not when Victor himself had chosen to say nothing, but had clearly opened a door for her to walk through. The thought of it made her chest tighten. She wasn't just a cleaner anymore, not in the eyes of the man who owned the estate, and not in the eyes of the boy who had begun to lean on her presence. Yet Anna felt no triumph in it, no rise in her sense of importance. Instead, she felt responsibility, like a clay pot placed in trembling hands. On her way out that night, she passed the guards by the east gate. One of them gave her a slight nod, not quite respectful, but not dismissive either. It felt like the first time someone had looked at her without looking through her. At the bus stop in Bakuru, she sat on the same concrete block she always did, her bag resting beside her, her eyes trained on the distance. She thought about calling her sister, about telling someone what had happened. But the story still didn't feel like hers to tell. Not yet. It belonged to Daniel. And until he had the words, she would carry it for both of them in silence. By the end of that week, Victor sent for her again, this time not to the drawing room, but to the smaller study tucked beside the west staircase, a room filled with wood-paneled shelves and the scent of old paper. It was early morning, and the sun had only just started casting golden light through the narrow windows. Anna stood at the doorway, unsure whether to step inside. Victor, seated behind the heavy mahogany desk, gestured for her to sit without speaking. There was a silence between them that didn't feel cold, only deliberate. He studied her face like someone trying to read a letter written in fading ink. Then he leaned back and spoke, his voice slower this time, like a man weighing his words. "I've been watching you longer than you think," he said. "Not just the boy. You." Anna didn't respond. There was nothing to say. "When you first started here," he continued, "you cleaned the walls as though the building owed you something. Every corner, every handle. You gave your back to this house like it had done something to you. He paused and gave a small shrug. I didn't understand it at the time. Anna sat still, her fingers clasped in her lap. Now I see it, he added. You don't work to be seen. You work because that's the only way you know how to survive. She looked at him, and for the first time, didn't feel intimidated. That boy needs something more than caretakers and comfort, Victor said. He needs someone who remembers what it's like to be forgotten. He stood and walked slowly to the window, hands clasped behind his back. I can offer you a position, temporary at first, he said, voice softer than it had been. Be with him. Stay close. Help him come back. Anna swallowed. Her throat was dry. Her hands were damp. The room seemed to tilt slightly beneath her. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an invitation into a world she had never been part of. A world of rooms she used to clean, now being opened to her with keys she never expected. She didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure how. But she knew one thing clearly. The boy, Daniel, was beginning to trust her. And trust, once given, was a weight not to be carried carelessly. The next morning, the estate felt unusually still, as though the air itself had paused to see what would happen next. Anna walked through the corridors with a quietness that wasn't just about her footsteps anymore. It was a quietness that came from the weight of a decision she hadn't yet voiced, but already felt forming inside her. The master's offer lingered in her mind like the echo of a bell. Be with the boy. Help him come back. The words were simple, but what they meant was anything but. For years, her life had been structured by repetition. Clean, rest, travel, start again. Nothing had ever asked her to be more than reliable, invisible, and competent. No one had ever looked past her uniform or the worn soles of her shoes. But now, the boy who had once hidden behind the shed looked at her as if she were something else. Not just a cleaner. Not just someone passing through. Anna stood in the small laundry room after her shift and washed her hands longer than usual, staring at the soap as it foamed around her fingers. She remembered her mother's hands, strong, cracked, always moving. Hands that never stopped, even when her voice did. That evening, she didn't take the bus home immediately. She found herself returning to the garden, even though Daniel had been relocated to a guest room near the west wing. A small room furnished with only the basics. A bed, a curtain, a wooden chair. It was better than the cold shed, but still far from home. He hadn't spoken much since moving inside. He walked quietly beside her in the mornings, ate slowly, responded with nods and shrugs. But when she looked into his eyes, she could see something stirring. He was beginning to believe he could stay. Anna was offered new clothes the following week, though she didn't ask for them. The estate tailor, a round-cheeked man from Kefi named Malamadu, brought them to her in silence. Simple blouses, soft skirts, a cardigan with wooden buttons. Nothing extravagant, but enough to mark her new place without announcing it. She folded the old uniform carefully and placed it in her locker, hesitating before closing the door. It felt like letting go of something that had defined her, even if it had limited her. For days after, she continued to rise early and clean the same hallway she'd always been assigned. Not because she had to, but because she couldn't quite imagine not doing it. The broom felt familiar in her grip, like a steady companion. Daniel's room, however, became the place her feet always returned to. At first, she hovered at the doorway, unsure if entering would feel like crossing a line. But he seemed to expect her. One morning, she found him seated on the floor, arranging stones from the garden into patterns, circles, squares, lines that formed shapes she didn't recognize. When she knelt beside him and asked softly what they meant, he whispered, "Memories." That word stayed with her all day. Each stone, it seemed, represented a moment he hadn't forgotten. A tree near the shed. A night spent hiding under a table. The voice of someone who had once lied. His memories didn't come in full stories yet, only fragments. But Anna knew how long it took for pain to find language. She didn't rush him. Instead, she told him stories from her own childhood, about her first time seeing a car, about fetching water from a well in Zaria, about a mango tree that refused to bear fruit for 3 years, and then suddenly fed the whole neighborhood one rainy season. Daniel listened without interrupting. His eyes never left her face. Sometimes he smiled, just slightly, and when he did, the room seemed less like a temporary space and more like a beginning. By the time the 3rd week passed, Victor called her again, not to ask, but to listen. The meeting took place in the library, a large room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves that smelled of cedar and aged paper. He didn't sit behind the desk this time. Instead, he stood near the window with his hands in his pockets. The atmosphere was less formal, but no less serious. He's eating more, Victor said, breaking the silence. Sleeping better, too. Anna nodded. She didn't speak unless asked, still unsure what part of her voice belonged in this new role. The staff says he doesn't talk to anyone but you, he added. That's not surprising. He turned and met her gaze. Children remember who reached for them when they were falling. There was no ceremony to his words, but they struck deep. He didn't praise her. He didn't thank her. But he made it clear she was no longer temporary. He spoke of schooling, of counselors, of the logistics that wealth could solve. But when it came to the boy's healing, he looked only at Anna. You're the part one can't buy, he said. That evening, Anna sat by the balcony that overlooked the orchard behind the estate. She watched the workers trimming the orange trees, their laughter soft in the distance. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a stranger in the place she worked. She felt anchored, not by wealth, not by recognition, but by the presence of a boy who had once eaten in silence behind a shed. She thought of how she had once envied the polished floors and glowing chandeliers, thinking they were the heart of the estate. But they weren't. The heart of the estate, she now knew, beat quietly in corners the world never looked at. Daniel began to speak more in the fourth week, slowly at first, in half-formed sentences and uncertain tones. He asked questions that surprised her, not about the estate, but about her. Where she came from. If she had brothers. What her favorite food was. She answered each one as truthfully as she could, careful not to overwhelm him. She told him about the smell of roasted maize by the road in Kaduna, about the sound of frogs after rain, about the way her sister Ella used to hum when nervous. One morning, he asked why she gave him her food the first time. Because you looked hungry, she said simply. He was quiet for a while, then responded, You did too. She smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was honest. The boy saw things most people didn't. That week, he asked to follow her on her rounds. She wasn't sure if the master would allow it, but she didn't stop him. He walked beside her as she dusted picture frames and adjusted curtains. At one point, he picked up a cloth and wiped a window alongside her. When another staff member passed and stared, Anna braced herself for scolding. But nothing happened. Life continued. The estate adjusted, just slightly, to accommodate a new rhythm. One evening, as they sat near the back stairs watching the sky darken into its usual purple haze, Daniel leaned his head gently against her shoulder. It was the first time he had ever reached for her. Not with words, not with hunger, but with closeness. She didn't move. She let him rest. In that quiet moment, she felt something settle into place, not a reward, not recognition, but something deeper. A kind of peace that didn't need to be spoken. It was the peace of two people who had survived, not alone but now together. The air over the estate had changed, though no one could quite put a name to it. Perhaps it was the way laughter occasionally echoed through the halls now, not the forced kind you hear during meetings or around wine glasses, but the soft, unscripted laughter of a child rediscovering how to breathe. Perhaps it was in the way the gardeners paused when Daniel walked past them, not because he was the master's grandson, but because he greeted them first. It was a quiet ripple, almost too subtle to name, but the estate had started to feel less like a monument and more like a place where living things belonged. Anna noticed it most in the small things, the way Daniel no longer avoided his reflection when passing mirrors, or how he left the door of his room slightly open instead of shut tight. He began waking up before she arrived, dressed and waiting, sometimes even holding his shoes in his hands, as if unsure whether he was allowed to wear them. She told him he didn't need permission. He smiled and wore them without asking again. The boy who once barely spoke now asked questions about the world. He wanted to know how radios worked, what made rain smell the way it did, and whether the moon followed people when they walked at night. He didn't ask about his parents. Not yet, and Anna didn't bring it up. She understood some wounds needed space, not explanation. She answered what he asked and left the rest to silence. But in that silence, something beautiful had begun to bloom. There came a day when Daniel asked to visit the kitchen. It was such a simple request, yet when he made it, Anna looked up from folding his shirt as though he had asked to fly to the sun. They walked together through the corridor, his fingers curled gently into the fabric of her sleeve. The kitchen, busy and full of clatter, fell silent when they entered. The cooks paused, their hands still, their eyes uncertain. No one had told them to expect him. Daniel clung closer to Anna, but he didn't retreat. One of the kitchen assistants, Mama Nkiru, broke the tension by offering him a piece of roasted plantain from a silver tray. You go like this one, small master, she said, her voice gentler than Anna had ever heard it. Daniel took it with two hands and whispered, Thank you. A new respect bloomed in the room. Not the kind forced by wealth or title, but something earned through recognition. The child was no longer a mystery whispered about between staff. He had become visible. And Anna, once invisible herself, stood with him, not behind, not to the side, but beside him. It wasn't long before Daniel asked to see other parts of the estate, the library again, the garden pond, the old horse stables. Anna accompanied him every time, answering his questions, holding his hand when the path got slippery, never leading, just walking with him. One afternoon, they sat beneath the mango tree near the back orchard, watching birds hop along the fence. "Do you think the birds forget where they've been?" he asked suddenly. Anna tilted her head, unsure. "Why?" she asked. Daniel picked at the grass between his fingers. "I feel like I'm supposed to remember something," he said. "But it's all scattered, like pieces of something I dropped." She didn't answer with words. She placed her hand gently over his and let the moment pass. He was remembering, and she wouldn't rush it. Victor began speaking to Daniel more directly, appearing in the hallways, offering soft greetings, sitting beside him during breakfast without pressing too hard. His efforts were cautious, almost clumsy, like a man learning to walk after years of standing still. Anna noticed how his posture softened around the boy, how he no longer used his full height to command attention. He asked Daniel what he liked to read, what foods made him sick, whether he preferred warm socks or slippers in the morning. These were questions most would find ordinary, but coming from Victor, they felt like olive branches. Daniel, in turn, responded with small nods, one-word answers, and on rare occasions, full sentences that made Victor's eyes flicker with something dangerously close to emotion. Anna remained nearby during these interactions, but never interfered. She understood she had helped open a door, but it was up to the boy and his grandfather to decide how far to walk through it. One evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Victor found her near the greenhouse. He stood for a while, saying nothing. The silence stretched between them like the space between stars. Then he said, "I should have found him sooner." Anna didn't reply. Regret was not a thing you could scrub clean. He looked at her then, really looked, as though only just realizing that someone like her had done what power and money had failed to do. "You gave him more than food," he said quietly. "You gave him back to us." Her response came gently. "He gave himself. I just waited where others passed by." Victor nodded once. A nod that said more than gratitude could. By the time the harmattan wind began to roll down from the north, sweeping the skies clean and making the evenings crisp, Daniel had changed in ways only Anna could truly measure. He no longer flinched at sudden footsteps. He laughed without covering his mouth. He began to sketch animals in a small notebook Victor had given him, drawings filled with surprising detail, each one signed with a small D at the bottom corner. One afternoon, he drew a picture of a woman standing under a mango tree, holding the hand of a small boy with tousled hair. He didn't say it was her, but Anna recognized the folds of her skirt, the way the woman stood slightly bent toward the child. She folded the paper and kept it in her Bible at home, tucked beside a photo of her sister. Weeks turned to months, and her visits to Bukuru became more frequent on weekends. She always returned before dawn on Mondays, never missing a day. The estate had become her second skin. And Daniel, no longer Finn, had become her reason. No grand announcements were made. No foundation was launched. No viral stories spread through town. Everything stayed quiet, grounded, and sacred. One morning, Anna stood outside Daniel's door, listening to him hum a melody she didn't know. A melody without lyrics. The kind children invent when they no longer fear being heard. She rested her hand on the doorknob and smiled. For the first time in a long, long while, she felt like something had come full circle. Not in fireworks, not in headlines, but in something far more powerful. A boy who had once been silent was singing again. Sometimes, the biggest miracles don't come wrapped in gold or glory. They come in the quiet moments, when you share your last meal, when you see someone others overlook, when you choose kindness even while carrying your own pain. Life doesn't always reward us where we expect, but never doubt that goodness plants seeds in the unseen. Keep doing what's right, even when no one is clapping. Someone may be watching. And even if no one is, God always is. May your hands never lack what to give. May your heart stay soft, even in a hard world. May your quiet acts of love return to you in loud blessings. Where others see nothing in you, may God see something powerful. May you be lifted in rooms you didn't even know existed. May your little acts become doors to greater favor. And may every tear you've ever cried water a future full of joy. In Jesus' name, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.